Greetings and welcome to the Department of Tangents podcast, Season 2, Episode 3, a conversation with author Paul Tremblay. Last spring, I read a tweet from author Paul Tremblay apologizing for his upcoming horror novel, Survivor Song. When he had turned in his final edits for the book months before, he could not have known how prescient it would seem, especially to his friends in the New England horror writing community. Survivor Song is set in Boston in the opening stages of an epidemic. A virus is spreading, hospitals are overwhelmed, the government is providing inadequate response. I won't go into it too much since I read it into the record in the episode, but he even mentioned a lack of PPE. That is where we begin the conversation, which also covers the reissues of his early comic noir novels about a narcoleptic private investigator, The Little Sleep and No Sleep Till Wonderland. Here's Paul Tremblay. So I wanted to start with a tweet that you sent out on May 7th, 2020. And your caption was a passage from my forthcoming novel, Sorry, and Hang in There. If you don't mind, I'll read a little bit from that. This is, the virus doesn't herald the end of the world or of the United States or even of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In the coming days, conditions will continue to deteriorate. Emergency service, I'm sorry for laughing at this, but it's emergency services and other public safety nets will continue to be stretched to their breaking points, exacerbated by the wily antagonists of fear, panic, misinformation, a myopic, sluggish federal bureaucracy further hamstrung by a president unwilling and woefully unequipped to make the rational science-based decisions necessary, and exacerbated, of course, by plain old individual everyday evil. That turned out to be a lot more prescient than maybe even it seemed, I think, in May. What were your thoughts in May as you're getting ready to release Survivor Song, a novel about an epidemic?
Mm-hmm. So by May, my head was maybe wrapped a little bit more around it. For me, the hardest time was March, and maybe even like February into March. Mid-March for me was when I went into sort of quarantine lockdown for my school. Mm-hmm. March into April, I think for all of us the scariest times, because it was still so much unknown about the coronavirus. Certainly compared to now. And the numbers were just, in terms of deaths in our area, the Boston area, were just, skyrocketing. So for me, that was, not that I've ever felt like, my book, was the cause of this, which is, silly. It's just like, there were two things. It's like, how in the world can I talk about this book?
Right.
I almost feel bad doing it. And, a lot of it was on a personal level, that a lot of the research that I did for the book, I had my sister help me. My sister, Erin, is a nurse at one of the biggest hospitals in Boston. And so I think a lot of, what people may or may, say, is prescient or whatnot is, due a lot in part due to her experiences as a nurse in Boston. Mm-hmm. Particularly they had we had in the United States an Ebola scare in 2014. Mm-hmm. Obviously the outbreak in Africa was huge and terrible. In the United States, I think we had 10 or 11 people infected with it. But there was one point where my sister's hospital said, hey, if there's a huge outbreak, we're going to take the bulk of the patients. And, they sent out like a PDF and a PowerPoint. It just seemed extremely lacking. And even saying like, we won't have enough personal protective equipment, PPE. I'd never heard that acronym before.
Neither had I.
Yeah. And so there's for anyone who reads Survivor Song, there's a text exchange within the novel that I put in, and I had asked my sister permission. I rewrote it somewhat, but the spirit of that text exchange was between my sister and her coworkers freaking out about not being prepared for Ebola and knowing like they'd be thrown into it without being prepared. Mm-hmm. And I was struck and still am struck by how they were still saying, hey, we're going to go in anyway. Thankfully there was no Ebola outbreak, but that sort of panic was a little bit of a preview of what she would go through. So, in March and April, I was just super concerned for my sister, concerned for everybody, obviously, but, she was in the teeth of it at the hospital.
Mm-hmm. Well, your job in writing this book is to think of the worst case scenario, the thing that would make people most fearful of an event like this. So when you see so much of that, like you said about PPE, I'd never heard that phrase. And I heard it I started hearing it in March. And then I think I got your book by the end of May to preview it. Mm-hmm. and there's so much of it there. I
Yeah.
mean, at one point I could imagine you must have thought, well, how much of my book is this going to follow from this point from this point on?
Yeah. No, and I was like, no, there's no way I'm going to get accused of like taking advantage of this. I'm like, yeah, I have proof that I wrote this well before it happened. And I don't know. And like, also, I mean, frankly, a lot of it wasn't hard to predict. Just, I'm not saying like I'm Kreskin, the great Kreskin,
Right.
but if you listen to epidemiologists and other scientists for years and years, it was always a matter of when, not if, a pandemic was going to happen. And I don't know, frankly, being a citizen of the United States, it wasn't that difficult to imagine or predict that Trump would and his administration would have an awful response to something like this, awful being an understatement of the year. If anything, I underestimated how terrible it would be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will say when I got the book, and I wrote this, the review for the Globe, so I got the preview a couple months before it came out. And there is a prologue in the book where there's a husband waiting in line because their food and things are being rationed, right, and you have to wait in line to get in. And his wife is sending him texts from home, worried texts from home. She's pregnant, not long until the baby's about to come. And she says, just come home. Don't worry about it. And my wife was not pregnant at the time, but everything else in that scenario had happened to me the week before I started reading your book. I had stood in line at the grocery store for the first time in like 3 months, nervously sending texts back and forth with my wife, who did tell me, just come home. It's not worth it to go in there with all that.
Yeah. Wow. Scary. And it's funny. Like, you read that tweet. I remember your email because you'd read the book. You said, can you verify when this was written for me? And I wonder, so that was after your wait at the grocery line.
It was I had gotten through that first exchange between the nurses and seen, it was the term PPE, which I hadn't heard before, and them talking about how the not being properly prepared for what's coming in and not knowing exactly what's going on. So it was, I had to verify you turned the thing in August and did your final edits in October, I think you said.
Yeah, late October into early November, but well before anyone had ever heard of the virus. Yeah.
To be fair, after the first few chapters, this diverges wildly from that reality of the pandemic. But those first few chapters are very uncomfortable. I mean, does part of you relish that being sort of close to reality? It's what you're trying for as an author, to show people something.
Right. I mean, that's hard to answer sort of honestly. I mean, I guess in a weird way, I mean, if I would say only based on the fact that something like this did happen, like I would trade that book. I would trade my career for the pandemic to have never have happened. Mm-hmm. But if we're going to have been forced to live through it, if that's sort of a condition, then I would say, I guess I am a little bit like, oh, I got some of it right. Or, it does, I don't know, it's part of it's like, oh, that means, I felt like, okay, I guess I was paying close attention to, I don't know, not even just the zeitgeist, but like, I don't know, I'm really stumbling to answer the question. So I guess, yes, sort of, but again, I would trade accuracy for no pandemic in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. Again, some of the other things that happen a little bit later in the novel, it's not a spoiler, but like, I've been obsessed for years. And it's really come to the forefront in the last few years with misinformation and how it's disseminated. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of been a theme in my previous novels, even starting with The Head Full of Ghosts, and certainly ratcheted up the novel before, Survivor Song, called Cabin at the End of the World, has some of that, misinformation, or how do we know what's real or not, within the media in the book as well. So, I mean, I feel like we could see all of that coming to a head, and it sort of all came, has come to a head really. Hopefully it's going to get better. I don't know. In the last year.
Well, it's part of that, the uncanny that a lot of horror authors reach for, something that is very close to the reader's reality. For those who aren't familiar with the concept, very close to somebody, but something's off and you can't tell exactly what.
Sure. I mean, I think most horror stories, the uncanny, or even like the idea of ambiguity, which I'm which in a weird way, Survivor Song is my least ambiguous novel of the recent bunch of novels that I've done. But there's still that aspect of, the idea of ambiguousness is so much a part of our, 21st century experience insofar as, how we're just bombarded with data, and it's, even for people who I feel like are smart and well read and, and stick with reasonable sources, it's just hard. Like, how do you deal with this constant flow of information and misinformation? That makes for a very sort of ambiguous existence, which is perfect for a horror novel.
Is that where the first impulse for this story started, or was it with the Ebola in 2014?
The first impulse for the story started with a what if that I wrote, but I can't say because it totally spoils the novel. But the what if was centered around, I was just trying to come up with different tropes that I haven't played with in the novel form. And I wrote down zombie. And like most people, I sort of like, oh, zombie. Because, we say that we're sick of them, but then we still sort of consume and watch or read zombie stuff. So then I had this what if. I was like, oh, I don't think that's sort of been played with before. And besides playing with the ambiguity, a thing that I've been doing for most of my recent novels is trying to take some horror elements or even a maybe supernatural element and trying to root it in reality, or at least in what I think would be as realistically as possible. So it's like, okay, I'm going to try to do this, sort of zombie or zombie adjacent novel as realistically as possible. And the rabies virus is just perfect. I really didn't have to do much to change the rabies virus for the book. All I really did was move up how long it took to become fully infected. Real rabies takes weeks, maybe even months. Whereas in my novel, it takes an hour or less. But like all the other symptoms of rabies, that's rabies.
So you do start this book with the stakes already pretty high. Natalie, one of the protagonists, is pregnant within a few weeks of giving birth. And the other main protagonist is Romola, her best friend, or one of her best friends, going back to her college days, who is also a doctor. Why settle on their points of view? And this is sort of told back and forth between Rams and Nat. That's, I think, the two names for the
so a couple of things I wanted to do. One was, okay, if I was going to do sort of a zombie novel, I wanted to try to be in some ways as different as I could, in some like simple ways. One, there's so many zombie narratives focuses on like what's going on everywhere with a cast of thousands, right? It's like, oh no, I'm going to do a much smaller story. I want to really focus in tightly on a few characters. And I thought it would be, I haven't really done like the three previous novels were all about families, parents dealing with their kids and vice versa. And even though, Natalie's pregnant, she hasn't had the child yet. She has no other kids. And this is really, to me, like a friendship novel. And there's another pair of characters who show up later in the book, that sort of demonstrates another kind of friendship. So that was, for me, different than the zombie part of it. I wanted the smaller, intimate story. I was going to, be in some ways thematically exploring a friendship. And also I wanted it to be over a really short period of time, as opposed to, again, like this big sprawling, there are so many that are great ones, but I just wanted to try to do something different and almost tell like with the exception of maybe the postlude, the story is really over 4 to 6 hours, maybe the amount of time it might take you to read the book, sort of like a real-time book. And those were some of the things I was excited to try.
And Romola, especially, I think I noted this in the review. I probably should have gone back and read my own review before this. Is the opposite of what you see in a lot of zombie stories. The hero tends to be somebody with a gun or somebody who wants to wipe out the zombies, and Romola is pointedly not that. Especially there's a scene where that's sort of a satire on zombie books and novels where they meet some kids who have appointed themselves like the zombie killers in this, and she stops them from further assaulting somebody who's been infected. Yeah,
I mean, given how this virus worked, it was, it's not something that's risen from the dead. There's no supernatural part of it. It's, it's a person who's infected and that their brain has just gone haywire. Now, granted, you don't want to be infected. You don't want them attacking you and biting you and stuff like that. But at the same time, she's there to say, hey, this isn't a video game. This is, it's a person. Again, like, I feel like that seemed realistic to me. especially coming from a character who's a medical worker. And again, in that 4 to 6 hours where it's like at that most sort of, it's really sort of just beginning or in the middle of the beginning where things are just starting to really get bad, where everyone's really not sure what's going to happen or how it's going to work out or if it's going to work out. I think so. All those anxieties are there. Romola still wants to save. She still wants to save people, even though she knows that one in particular that you're talking about, can't be saved. Which may or may not be a parallel for other things that happen in the book later.
That there is some precedent for that in sort of like the last couple of George Romero films, or where they were trying to introduce the idea that these things are still human. Maybe we could fix this, but
Right.
Generally it's not the type of Romola. I feels like a different sort of character than you see in these types of stories. And I hesitate to call it a zombie story necessarily, because I know it's an epidemic, but I guess you'd say zombie / epidemic.
Yeah. Right.
And we don't know that this spread around the world, right? The stakes, we just know what the stakes are mainly for these two people.
Right. And, I do say, and I've been saying this because I don't think it's a very big spoiler, because to me, this was an important idea, and I actually had to gently fight with my editor to keep it a little bit. But I do say, as sort of, I break in as the narrator at one point and say, you read it in the tweet, right? This isn't the end of the world. This isn't the end of the United States nor of Massachusetts. So I kind of thought I wanted that was like an important thing for me as well, that over the short timeline, the idea that this isn't the end of the world. This isn't a post-apocalyptic, thing, like The Walking Dead or something. And I don't know, to me, that I felt like that made it more poignant, more tragic, potentially. It's like, man, if, these people, the people, if there are characters who don't make it, if they could have just held on somehow, for another day, another week, another two, things get better. It's not the end.
And you called it Survivor's Song, and you say somewhere in the narrative as well, this is a song.
Right.
I mean, is that the philosophy behind it, that this is one small, shorter sort of story, a part of a larger collection?
No, absolutely. I really tried to think, I don't know, I'm a big music nerd / fan. And so many of my favorite songs are sort of, punk and short and fast and loud, and also like hopeful, but in a melancholy sort of sad way too. Like really fast, loud dirges sometimes, So I wanted sort of that feel for the book in whatever way I could, even if it was just like the title.
Yeah, I think you could say that the musical idea that is another theme of yours is maybe not resolving that final chord in the sequence, which is well, I don't know. Do you at the end of Cabin at the End of the World, when you were talking about maybe trying to look at something different in the ending? Do you think the ending to this, without I don't want, I'm trying not to to give away specifics of it, do you think that this ended differently than your past few books in terms of how you resolve things for the characters?
Yeah, no, I definitely think, this book, especially compared to Cabin, and also Handful of Ghosts, I suppose. No, I do think like we know, well, we know the fate of the characters. Like we may not know what's going to happen to them 10 years after like the last page, but I think certainly some things are resolved. Yeah, I think there's there's resolution there. It's funny. I tried to I half joked to some people that I was going to fake an ambiguous ending, and I mess around with the interior design a little bit. I don't want to say too much more, but no, there's definitely whereas the Cabin at the End of the World, it's left. I'm going to be not fair to myself. I'm going to be obnoxious. So with Cabin, yes, I guess in one aspect of for Cabin, sure, I don't tell you if the world ends or not. But to me, that's not the end of the Cabin at the End of the World. That book is about the choice that two characters make. That's the story. It doesn't matter if the world ends or not. It shouldn't matter. Like, I don't know. I mean, I get, there are all sorts of different readers, and God love them all.
Well, there's something to be said for leaving for two people who've read the book. My wife and I both read the book, and we had the conversation. Well, what do you think?
Sure. Oh yeah, I mean, I understand it's a totally fun conversation to have, but I guess I just to explain for myself is like, to me, the story is everyone else's now that it's out there. So that's what I'm saying. For me, like, the book became about the choice. their world was shattered one way or the other. Like, whatever, their choice was, to me, became sort of the resolution of that story. And I can honestly say I have not thought 1 nanosecond beyond the last line of Cabin at the End of the World. Yeah.
So there's, I listened to the audio book version of this again, and I caught something that made me wonder, maybe I have to go back and look through the other books and see if there's a reference to this in there. There's a reference to a math teacher you don't want to mess with. In you being a math teacher as your day job, I wondered, is this something that you've threaded through? Should we be looking through the other stories and the other books for reference to math teachers?
Wow, I forgot I even did that. I mean, I have a short story called The Teacher, but he's not a math teacher. Yeah, I'm definitely, people tell me all the time, it's like, I would love to have you as a math teacher. I'm like, you probably wouldn't. I'm a lot more fun as a writer and talking about writing. As a math teacher, I'm kind of strict and old school. Not lame strict, but I don't know. I have expectations of the students. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so some parts of it is, writing a novel, for me, it takes 12 to 15 months normally, sometimes more. I don't know. It's just a little self-indulgent. As long as it doesn't get in the way, it's just sometimes just throwing in like that is just like a little bit of a fun thing. I'm very privileged and honored to be at the point where I've had a bunch of books out, and I do have like some readers that sort of follow me from book to book. So sometimes I feel like it's kind of fun just to throw that in there for people who have been sticking with my weird books for a while. Hopefully they get a kick out of stuff like that.
So how did you come to re-release The Little Sleep and No Sleep Till Wonderland?
Part of it was just like opportunity. They were originally published in 2009 and 2010 by Henry Holt, and I don't know. So the first book, The Little Sleep, did okay. The second book had no shot and just sank for a variety of boring reasons. But we got the rights back. When I say we, my agent and myself, my agent was very helpful. Because it took like a year and a half. You have to. Most contracts is like 7 years at least, and then like you sort of have to prove it's out of print. However, which gets tricky now because of ebooks. It's getting trickier. But we were able to demonstrate, you're not the book sold threshold is not being made here, so they're considered out of print. So we got the rights back, and we figured, we'll see if someone wants to re-release them. Why not? And I'm very happy that both my publishers in the U.S. and the U.K. wanted to put them back in print. I'm excited, and I'll also say it's kind of weird now that they are out because I don't know. I wrote The Little Sleep in 2007. I'm just a much different writer, and to the point where like No Sleep to Wonderland, someone who read the book like a week or two ago would probably be able to better explain the plot of that book than I could right now. Because it's been so long, and I haven't read either book in over 10 years. Like I didn't, they didn't even go through edits with me this time. They just basically took the finished files that were with Henry Holt and just re-put them out there. So I didn't even have to go through which was kind of nice actually. I didn't have to go through the copy editing part all over again. So it's weird to have these bits of me that are, more than a decade old, and, so much has happened in this decade plus, both as a person and as a writer. Yeah. And I don't know. Because in particular, No Sleep to Wonderland, like that was the end of the deal, and the publisher didn't want anything to do with me after that. That whole experience sort of threw me for a loop, and I spent like 3 years not writing much after that and just being sort of bitter and unhappy about, what the publishing experience was. And I don't know, it took me, once I learned to let go of that, or at least be honest about those feelings, and then being able to move on from them. Once I did that, I don't think it's any surprise that that's when I had the idea for Head Full of Ghosts. It just took me a little bit to get through it. And that, I think that's for anybody who's about to be published by a big publisher for the first time. If I had any advice, would be, you still have to do a lot of your own. You have to do a lot of your own pushing of the book, etc. And it may not work out, and you'll probably be surprised that that your big publisher has so many other books. You're probably like a little fish, and you're not getting much push put behind you, and it's just very disorienting because you think, oh my God, I made it. I'm going to have this book published,
right?
And then it could just go it can just be such a blip. It's like just head spinning.
Well, I mean, and they're very different books as well.
Sure.
I mean, these were your first two books that were published, A Little Sleep and No Sleep Till Wonderland, and they are very much crime noir with a very strong comic element.
Yeah.
To
hopefully,
them.
Hopefully comic.
Well, I would say that if having just read both of them, I'm 40 pages shy from the end of No Sleep Till Wonderland.
Okay.
But having just read both of them, if you were to give me those books and your first couple of horror books, and if I were to read them back to back to back to back, I wouldn't guess the first two were written by the same person.
Oh, wow.
As Head Full of Ghosts and Devil's Rock are the next few books.
Well, I think that's true. I think, you know, a different person, you know, it's sort of in sort of the mental space that I was writing from. You know, also, like, you know, The Little Sleep and No Sleep to Wonderland was sort of purposefully using this Chandler-esque voice, you know, that's sort of not my natural writing voice too. But oh, that's interesting. No one said that to me. I think that's really cool. I like that.
But it's partly that writing style. I mean, there are things like, I think at one point, Mark Genovich, who's the detective in the series,
right?
You know, he'll say things like, I was there to ask about the truth, not tell the truth. There's a difference. And, you know, descriptions of things like the light burst through the shades and left pieces of itself around the room. It's very much in that sort of style of language. So how do you transition from one to the other? I mean, it had No Sleep Till Wonderland been a blockbuster, would you still be writing these novels, and would you have ever come up with Head Full of Ghosts?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, when I first sold The Little Sleep, I told my agent, like, I shouldn't say when I first sold it, when I first gave it to him, he said, like, I have no interest in writing a series. I told him that just because, like, I'm not a series reader generally. You know, The Little Sleep to me was Mark's story. That was it. I didn't have any more. But then Henry Holt wanted a second novel. And that was actually one of the hardest things I've ever done, was to come up with that second book of Mark. And I'm very proud. Like, that was like part of like the reason that book sort of messes with my head. I was like really proud that I was able to do this thing that I wasn't, you know, planning on doing. Like, you know, I wrote this book for the publisher. They wanted it, you know, with the same character, and I wasn't planning on doing that. I had pitched them a third idea, because to me, The Little Sleep is about Mark's past. No Sleep is really about his present. And I was like, I'll write one more about his future. And I would have called it Sleep at the End of the World, with like Mark trying to solve like a last case as like a Category 5 hurricane was coming up to wipe out Boston. But they, you know, based on the sales of those previous novels, they had no interest in it. And then, you know, Ben Winters recently did a crime series where The Last Policeman, I think, was the first book, where an asteroid was coming down. So it's like, I'll never write No Sleep. I'll never write, you know, Sleep at the End of the World, because that's already sort of been done.
Yeah, and you couldn't title it that now anyways.
Right,
Cabin.
Yeah.
Would you ever revisit this character? I mean, he's for those who haven't read the books yet, they were just re-released in January and April respectively. It's a narcoleptic private investigator who's sort of the opposite of your swaggering private detective. He realizes nothing goes right. He realizes nobody finds his lines funny, but he's tenacious enough that he's the last one standing.
That's a great way to describe him. I appreciate that. Yeah. Usually, like, a detective is like almost like a superhero without the cape. So I would never say never, but I haven't really like thought of going back to crime. I'm pretty happy with the space that I'm in now. And partly it's because my editor at Morrow really gives me like a wide sort of definition of what I can consider horror. So, for example, the novel I just turned in, I'm waiting for edits that will, you know, should be out next summer. You know, so it's under the horror umbrella, but it's written as it's written as a memoir of a character who may, you know, who is like sort of alternate reality me. And I do think in a fun way, it's kind of taking the first person Little Sleep and A Head Full of Ghosts and mashing them together, because there is, hopefully, I want this book to be funny in a lot of places, but I also want it to be scary in certain places. You know, most horror comedies, the humor comes from the horror. Like the horror aspect is supposed to be the funny part. And I want this book to sort of do both. I want it to be funny where it's supposed to be funny, but, you know, scary and disturbing when it's supposed to be.
Yeah, humor and horror do have there's a lot of similarities in how they might work, including the sort of twist that you have, because you've got to lead somebody somewhere and then push them off somewhere they weren't expecting to get that laugh or to get that gasp.
Right. You have to build that tension. And I don't know, I've always, for me, like my first started writing was all horror short fiction. My first novels that I wrote were satirical, like darkly humorous.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I wonder why that is. And I think what we were just discussing, horror and humor, is so related. It's, you can, you could boil it down to like the absurdities of life. You could have one of two reactions. You could just laugh maniacally at it, or, react in terror from it, but it's really sort of the same thing that we're reacting to. It's just maybe a little left turn or a right turn, depending on, what reaction you're going for.
I will say, following your Twitter, it's nice to sort of see, I think it's hopeful for a lot of people that you'll tweet something like, excited and relieved that my agent loves the Pallbearers Club. He kind of has to, but also I know when he's being genuine. After, having all these books that are so well received and critically acclaimed and selling well, like the people think the assumption is, well, that they must just take whatever you give them now.
Well, my agent kind of has to. But no, there is the question of the publisher for sure. My editor saw 30 pages in a summary, and really like the summary for probably like the last half of it, what ends up happening in the book is much different. So, I think she has a general idea of what she's supposed to expect, but it's still so much different than when you actually have like the book in front of you. Mm-hmm. So yeah, no, but in general for me, that's been another sort of weird discovery, is that the self-doubts have never gone away. If anything, I feel like they're getting more intensified.
Where would you like to be? What's the, are you in mostly the position you'd like to be in as a writer?
That's a really great question. And that's why I don't know if I can answer, because I think about that a lot. I think this past year sort of forced everybody to sort of reevaluate, what makes you happy, what doesn't make you happy. And I honestly don't know, like writing has become like a really stressful thing in my life. But at the same, it's like this weird sort of, bipolar experience. Like it's really exciting, but at the same time, like I've never been so anxious / depressed about stuff as I have about writing in the past 5 years, which might be sort of weird to say because my writing's never been more successful, but
it's a legitimate second job now.
Yeah.
Too, for you.
I think I need to just have one job. I think I'd probably feel less anxious about the writing stuff if I was just doing writing. But, there's financial factors, kids going to college and have to pay for and stuff like that. So I don't know. If a Hollywood movie were to happen, I think I would take the leap. But we'll see.
Is there anything else coming out that you want to tell people about?
Geez. No, so the Little Sleep and No Sleep to Wonderland are out now. The trade paperback for Survivor Song will be out the first week of July. I did a little extra for it. I wrote like a 2,000-word liner notes essay. I'm actually quite proud of about the book, about like some of it's like how I wrote it, but also like it's an essay about 2020 in some ways too. As you mentioned, or as we talked about, the Pallbearers Club next year. Hopefully.
And the mass market for Survivor Song coming out in September, right?
So September, yeah.
Have you had a mass market?
Cabin was my first one.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool. Like, it seems that's where you start seeing yourself at supermarkets, maybe, right? Is that where?
Yeah. I think, I know Walmart for sure. None of my supermarkets around me had Cabin, but that's fine.
You're like standing behind somebody in line and with like a couple bags of chips and something, and they're looking at the books, and you sort of nod.
Right.
You're like, hey, that's right there is my thing.
I'll admit some like. I've been very fortunate and privileged that like my wife didn't lose her job. I didn't lose either of my jobs. Mm. I haven't been in a grocery store in a year. I have to go to the, so we've been lucky that we have a Target close by that delivers. Mm-hmm. So we get half our groceries there, and there's a farm that delivers too. So we've just been sticking with the delivery part of it. Mm-hmm. So I go to like Walgreens and stuff. Like that's really my supermarket experience is, getting prescriptions and stuff like that. But,
Well, thank you for doing this. I appreciate you coming on NFL draft night when I know you'd prefer to be in front of the TV figuring out.
It is going to be an interesting draft.
The trade.
Draft talk is a better way to end than me telling you about me going to Walgreens, I think. So.
Probably. Well, we could also leave it as a tribute to some of your previous books. Unresolved, exactly. Yeah, the Patriots quarterback conundrum is going to be unresolved after tonight, I fear. Did the podcast end?
Or did it not?
Thanks again to Paul for the interview. His new novel, Survivor Song, is out in paperback in July, and The Little Sleep and No Sleep Till Wonderland are out now wherever you get good books. His website is www.paultremblay.net, and you can follow him on Twitter and Instagram at Paul G. Tremblay. If you liked this episode, please consider subscribing on Apple, Google, or Spotify so you never miss an episode, and find more material at departmentoftangents.com. And please tell your friends, your family, strangers, spread the links. Thanks for listening.
Neil Young!